Episode 23, Cracks Within Kirtland, Ohio. Welcome back to Hidden and Distorted History of the Church, where we uncover the lesser-known truths about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons. My goal is to reveal the authentic, historical facts behind the Mormon Church. Recap. Last time, we uncovered how the Smith family used profits from the first sales of the Book of Mormon to bail Joseph Smith Sr. out of debtor's prison, completely bypassing Martin Harris, who was left to lose his farm because of unpaid loans he took out to fund the Book of Mormon's printing. We also saw how Joseph Smith aided both his father and Hiram in dodging arrests for further debts. And let's not forget the early groundwork Joseph laid for polygamy, when he told 12-year-old Mary Elizabeth Rollins that she would one day be his wife, something that came to pass. This week, we dive into the United Order, examining how Joseph seized total control over his followers' belongings. We also meet Ezra Booth, the first member to publicly challenge Joseph and the church, and see how Joseph dealt with this defiance. But before that, we'll expose the controversy surrounding the supposed Melchizedek priesthood and whether Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery get caught in a bold-faced lie. Part 1. Breaking the con of Cowdery and Smith Jr. Let's dig into the tangled mess surrounding the so-called Melchizedek priesthood, because church history presents some glaring contradictions beyond what we explored in episode 14, Joseph's false claims on the priesthood. Time for a quick recap. The LDS Church claims historical records describing the reception of this higher authority are generally less specific and more complex. Some accounts describe Peter, James, and John, three of the apostles called by Jesus Christ in the New Testament, appearing to Smith and Cowdery and bestowing on them a higher priesthood, later called the Melchizedek priesthood. Other accounts describe an earlier event at the home of Peter Whitmer Sr., when the voice of God commanded Smith and Cowdery to ordain one another to the office of elder in a public meeting of baptized believers. Joseph Smith tells us he and Oliver received this higher priesthood in 1829, but here's where the cracks start to show. Fast forward 2 years to June 1831. The conference notes from that time state, Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon were ordained to the high priesthood under the hand of Burr, Lyman White. Later, in History of the Church 1:175-76, Joseph himself recorded, the authority of the Melchizedek priesthood was manifested and conferred for the first time upon several of the elders. Think about this for a moment. Joseph claimed that he and Oliver were baptized under the authority of Peter, James, and John in 1829, supposedly receiving the higher priesthood then and there. But how do you explain the fact that in 1831, Joseph and Sidney are receiving this same priesthood for the first time? If Joseph already had it, why the need for another ordination? It raises serious questions about the credibility of Joseph's claims. To top it all off, on August 28th, 1831, Sidney Rigdon conferred the higher priesthood upon Oliver Cowdery, the very same Oliver Cowdery who was supposedly bestowed this sacred authority alongside Joseph Smith. This blatant contradiction screams of inconsistency and outright deception. How could Oliver be reordained to something he was supposedly given directly by divine beings just 2 years earlier? The Mormon Stories podcast, known for its rigorous research, tries to shed light on this issue. This is the first time the word priesthood is referenced within church. Recognizing the problem, B.H. Roberts, as church historian, inserted a footnote denying the text. From my own research, the term priesthood had indeed been used before, but only in connection to the Aaronic priesthood, never the higher one, though we get this information from Joseph's own history, which he dictated many years later. The Whitmer family, close to the Smiths during the early days, had not even heard of the higher priesthood until 1834-35. They believed that Joseph and Oliver had fabricated the entire story about Peter, James, and John. So what are we left with? A troubling set of inconsistencies that call into question whether the Melchizedek priesthood narrative was a convenient invention used to reinforce Joseph's evolving leadership and spiritual authority. It's becoming clear that there are significant holes in the official story. It's hard to deny that David Whitmer was onto something when he insisted that there was no higher priesthood conferred on Joseph and Oliver in 1829. The evidence points to a troubling truth. The story of Peter, James, and John bestowing the Melchizedek priesthood is a fabrication. This revelation doesn't just poke holes in Joseph's narrative, it exposes a calculated move. To me, it's clear that Joseph wasn't just creating spiritual authority out of thin air. He was building the foundation for absolute control. By fabricating the so-called higher priesthood and claiming divine authority, Joseph was setting the stage to place himself above everyone else, crafting an untouchable leadership structure that put him in complete command. This wasn't about revelation, it was about power, plain and simple. Part 2, yet another supposed revelation. We face yet another glaring inconsistency in the timeline of the LDS Church regarding the location of Zion and the New Jerusalem. Remember back in episode 20, when Hiram Page dared to give a revelation about Zion's location? Joseph Smith swiftly rebuked him, claiming that Page had overstepped since Joseph hadn't yet received the revelation himself. And then, as if by magic, shortly after the rebuke, Joseph conveniently receives a revelation in September of 1830 that Zion would be located on the borders of Missouri, near the native territories. How convenient. Now fast forward to July 20th, 1831. Joseph decides to personally travel to Missouri. While there, he suddenly receives yet another revelation, this time pinpointing the exact location of the city of Zion and the New Jerusalem. Hold on a minute, didn't he supposedly get this revelation 2 years earlier? Or did God give Joseph the state, but leave him clueless about the exact site, just waiting for him to stumble upon it during his travels? This raises serious questions about Joseph's so-called prophetic abilities. It seems that, unlike other biblically claimed prophets who could receive divine knowledge from afar, Joseph had to physically be present to gain his first-hand revelation. One has to wonder, was this divine intervention, or simply Joseph adapting his narrative based on circumstance? Either way, the inconsistencies are too large to ignore. Part 3, Challenges to Joseph's Authority. Ezra Booth was an early member in the Latter-day Saint movement who became an outspoken critic of Joseph Smith and the Church of Christ. He was the first apostate to write publicly against the new church. Before joining the early Church of Christ in 1831, Booth worked as a Methodist Episcopal minister and a farmer in Ohio. After his baptism, he moved with his family to Kirtland and served as a missionary, preaching in Missouri and Ohio. Booth left the church later in 1831, 5 months after his baptism. He proceeded to write a series of 9 letters denouncing Mormonism that were published by the Ohio Star. What caused this reaction within Ezra Booth? On June 4th, 1831, Ezra Booth was ordained a high priest by Lyman White in a simple log schoolhouse in Kirtland. What followed was an event that reeks of manipulation and theatrics. During the meeting, Booth was said to be possessed by a foul spirit, which Joseph Smith conveniently commanded to depart. This wasn't just spiritual showmanship. It was a power move designed to solidify Joseph's divine authority in front of those present. 2 days later, Booth was called to Missouri with Isaac Morley to preach the word by the way, as per Joseph's instructions. Booth, known for being an urbane and articulate preacher, saw early success, even converting figures like Simon's Rider. His presence was notable in the church, attending the August 4th conference in Jackson County, Missouri, and witnessing the laying of the cornerstone for the temple at New Jerusalem. But the cracks started to show. Booth, expecting to convert people through miraculous acts, something Joseph had led him to believe, found himself disillusioned when those miracles never materialized. His discontent grew. Richard Bushman, a well-respected historian, summed up Booth's frustration perfectly. Every attempt at healing became a test, and as his faith waned, he noted only failures. Booth's disillusionment is telling. While believers like John Whitmer clung to stories of miraculous healings, Booth saw through the charade, recognizing Joseph's promises for what they were, empty. This wasn't divine power, but calculated deception. On September 6, 1831, Ezra Booth's short-lived career in the Mormon Church came to an abrupt end. Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Oliver Cowdery, and other church leaders silenced him from preaching as an elder, citing his growing dissent and lack of humility as reasons for his fall from grace. But this wasn't just an internal disciplinary action. It was a calculated effort by Smith and his inner circle to silence a voice that threatened their grip on power. Booth had become a problem, one that needed to be eliminated swiftly. In true fashion, Joseph Smith claimed divine backing for this decision. A few days later, a revelation was conveniently delivered, stating, "I, the Lord, was angry with him who was my servant Ezra Booth, and also my servant Isaac Morley, for they kept not the law, neither the commandment. They sought evil in their hearts. They condemned for evil that thing in which there was no evil." While Morley was apparently forgiven, Booth was cast aside. Booth didn't go quietly. Less than 3 days after being silenced, and having been a member for only 5 months, Booth renounced Mormonism. In a bold move, he published a series of 9 explosive letters in the Ohio Star, starting in November 1831. These letters, addressed to Reverend Era Eddy, tore into Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and the very fabric of Mormonism itself. Booth didn't mince words. He accused Smith of delivering inconsistent revelations, criticized the despotic nature of the church's leadership, and exposed what he saw as the manifest weakness of both Joseph Smith and his closest allies. Booth's criticism was damning. He specifically called out Sidney Rigdon and pointed to the utter failure of the Mormon mission to convert Native Americans, something Smith's revelations had predicted would succeed. Booth's letters weren't just angry rants. They were carefully crafted exposés, aimed at preventing others from being duped by what he now saw as the diabolical pretensions and impositions of the church. The impact of these letters was immediate and powerful. In Norton Township, where Booth had been sent on his mission, public opinion swiftly turned against the church. Booth's words effectively overthrew Mormonism in the area, and the letters became so popular that the Ohio Star printed them almost weekly. Fear and suspicion toward the growing power of the Mormon Church spread throughout Kirtland and Hiram, Ohio, prompting Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon to rush to the area in a desperate attempt to control the damage. But the damage had been done. Booth's letters sparked a fire that would prove hard to extinguish, and they were later reprinted by E.D. Howe in his 1834 book Mormonism Unveiled, cementing Booth's role as one of the first and most vocal critics of Joseph Smith's authority. Booth's letters struck such a deep blow to Joseph Smith and the church that they launched a full-blown smear campaign against him. Doctrine and Covenants Central tries to downplay Booth's motivations, quoting President Joseph Fielding Smith, who claimed, "Through the performance of a miracle he was baptized, and from that time he desired to make men believe by the performance of miracles, even by smiting them or with forcible means." Elder George A. Smith, eager to further discredit Booth, suggested that it was about money, not miracles. He, having formerly been a Methodist minister, commenced preaching the gospel without purse or script, and he did so until he found, using a common expression, it did not pay. Fellowship was officially withdrawn from Booth on September 6, 1831. The Lord, through Joseph, revealed his anger. "I, the Lord, was angry with him who was my servant Ezra Booth, for he kept not the law, neither the commandment." This, of course, is Joseph's attempt to frame Booth's departure as a divine judgment, rather than the result of legitimate grievances. But the venom didn't stop there. Doctrine and Covenants Central goes on to quote Joseph Smith directly, where he describes Booth's letters as nothing more than vain calculations to overthrow the work of the Lord, and further claimed they exposed Booth's weakness, wickedness, and folly, leaving him as a monument of his own shame for the world to wonder at. It's clear Booth rattled Joseph deeply. His letters weren't just a minor annoyance. They threatened to unravel the carefully constructed image Joseph was building. Booth's exposé not only angered Joseph, but revealed just how fragile his authority truly was. Booth didn't just leave the church. He shook its very foundations with his brutal revelations, exposing cracks that Joseph was desperate to cover up. Part 4. Joseph Smith's United Order. The United Order was Joseph Smith's attempt to establish complete control over his followers' lives, veiling it under the guise of religious and economic equality. Ostensibly, this system aimed to create egalitarian communities where poverty would be eliminated and members could achieve self-sufficiency. But let's not be fooled by the seemingly noble intent. At its core, the United Order required members to relinquish their property to the church, making Joseph Smith the ultimate arbiter of their wealth and livelihood. Sure, Smith drew inspiration from other utopian movements like the Campbellites, But where their communalism was largely voluntary and focused on shared ideals, Joseph's approach was far more insidious. Want to remain in his church? You'd better hand over your property. This wasn't just a suggestion. During the 1830s, it was a requirement for continued membership. The process itself was manipulative. Participants would consecrate all their property to the United Order, only to have a portion of it deeded back to them as an inheritance or stewardship. This wasn't about eradicating private property. It was about ensuring that Joseph Smith held the ultimate control. After all, anything extra a family produced was expected to be voluntarily given back to the order, overseen by the local bishop who answered directly to Joseph. Joseph's claim that this system was an everlasting order for the benefit of my church and for the salvation of men until I come was far from everlasting. It was short-lived, and for good reason. The entire system was more about consolidating power than saving souls. Smith wasn't just establishing a religious movement. He was building an empire where control of property meant control of people. The LDS Church's portrayal of the United Order is nothing short of revisionist spin, designed to whitewash a failed system of control. On their official website, they conveniently omit the disaster that occurred during Joseph Smith's time when he tried to run his own United Order. Instead, they jump ahead to the 1880s and paint a rosy picture, stating, intending to shore up smaller communities' resources against outside interests, local and general church leaders developed a system called the United Order in about 150 settlements. They make it sound like a well-organized cooperative system where members pooled resources to combat external pressures and help the poor. But let's be real. This isn't an accurate reflection of what Joseph Smith originally implemented. The LDS Church is being deliberately misleading by separating the United Order from the law of consecration. In reality, the United Order was just the name, while the law of consecration was the practice of forcing members to hand over their property. The Church, as it so often does, is trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, suggesting that the two were separate and distinct when they were in fact intertwined. This is part of a larger pattern of how they've spun uncomfortable historical realities into palatable half-truths for modern believers. This isn't just a semantic game. It's an attempt to mask the total failure of the United Order during Joseph Smith's life, a system that collapsed under the weight of its own flawed principles. Despite the Church's efforts to twist the narrative, the fact remains, Joseph's United Order was about control, not community. The Church may continue its cheeky attempts at revisionism, but the historical record shows a clear pattern of failed authoritarian schemes, thinly veiled as divine guidance. What were the problems with the original United Order? The United Order was implemented unevenly across various communities, with some bishops and leaders interpreting the doctrine differently. This inconsistency made it difficult to create a cohesive and functional system. While some areas followed the system strictly, others did not, leading to confusion and dissatisfaction among members. Although the United Order allowed members to control their stewardship, ownership of the property remained with the Church. This led to disputes over what could or could not be done with the property. For many, the fact that they had to deed over all of their possessions to the Church only to receive a portion back made them feel as if they were being exploited. Some church members were confused about how the United Order fit into broader church doctrine. While Joseph Smith promoted it as part of the law of consecration, it wasn't always clear how the system would function in the long term. This ambiguity caused frustration among members who didn't see the system as practical or sustainable. Despite its original vision of being an everlasting order, the United Order was short-lived during Joseph Smith's lifetime. It was soon replaced by other, less restrictive systems, reflecting the practical impossibility of maintaining such a utopian ideal in the face of resistance and logistical challenges. In short, Joseph Smith's United Order collapsed under the weight of its impracticality, coercion, mismanagement, and internal resistance. While the system may have been rooted in noble goals like wealth equality and community support, its implementation was deeply flawed and ultimately unsustainable. Though it appears Smith's overall goal was total control over the membership, in conclusion, the cracks in Joseph Smith's authority and the Church's narrative are becoming impossible to ignore. From the suspicious contradictions surrounding the Melchizedek priesthood, to the conveniently timed revelations about Zion, to the unraveling of his control through the United Order, what we're seeing is a pattern of manipulation and deception. Ezra Booth's bold criticisms expose Joseph's fragile claims to divine power, and the deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes. Joseph wasn't just leading a religious movement, he was building a system of control, using revelation as a tool to maintain his grip on followers. The next episode, we dive into what led Joseph Smith to be tarred and feathered in the spring of 1832. Keep watching as we continue to peel back the layers of the church's hidden and distorted history. Please watch for future videos, and thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for the day.